just a little bit on fermentation in reds before we move on to the wines. You talk about things when you use stems, when you use whole bunches, just different ways you choose to make wine and what you get from those parts of the winemaking process. If that's not too broad in general.
Do you want me to answer that first, or?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so stems. I think stems are probably one of the things that we really, knew so little about when I certainly graduated from uni. And I think even working for big companies, there wasn't a lot of whole bunch use or, the use of stems in winemaking. But even now we're learning more and more about, the use of whole bunch, fermentation and not necessarily carbonic maceration, but just including whole, having a bin of whole bunches, and basically, putting a bit of fermenting wine in the bottom of it and treading a small portion of it each day until you sort of get around it and things like that over a sort of 4 to 5 day period. But I think there's a lot of real merit in that sort of thing, and I think it can give some very interesting characters. I think one of the most interesting aspects of whole bunch fermentation that we find is that we get less whole bunch character when we do 100% whole bunch than we do when we do partially whole bunch fermentation. So, and it's probably got something to do with the juice to whole bunch ratio in 100% whole bunch is so much lower. There's very little juice really in the thing to be absorbing all of this, these sort of stemmy characters. Whereas when we put maybe 20 or 25% whole bunches in a destemmed ferment, into some crushed grapes or partially crushed grapes, you do absorb a lot of that stemmy character sort of in the rest of the wine, in 75% of the rest of the wine. So we're tending more to do 100% whole bunch fermentation in a sort of in a vessel, and then we're doing 100% destemmed or hopefully perfectly destemmed fruit, and doing some intracellular fermentation. So fermentation in the berry itself. So we're looking for the for those sort of classical Henri type whole berry ferments, and on one hand, and then we're looking at 100% whole bunch in the other, and then perhaps having a look at blending the two, later on.
Okay. Fab. What about you, Izele?
I must agree that it's so interesting that when you think you do like 100%, it's going to be different, and it's so true that I've done a lot of trials with adding 20% of whole bunches at the bottom of the tank, or 20% in the middle, or 20% on top. You get 3 different wine styles of it's the same grapes, just adding the whole bunches in a different portion of the tank. It actually makes a difference. Same with Petit Verdot. I don't do whole bunches with Petit, I do whole berries. So when you put the whole berries at the bottom, middle, or at the top, it's totally different wines. And it's amazing how a small thing like that can actually make or break a wine. So when the grapes arrive in my small little winery, we put it in a container, so reefer cold to make it cold overnight. So I always say the grapes get the opportunity to sleep at KWV to adapt for their first night out. So they sleep at KWV for the first night. Then the next day we will do bunch sorting and berry sorting, and then I do cold soak. So I do add enzymes and tartaric acid on the grapes as soon as it arrives in the winery. So Steve, when I started at KWV, our chief winemaker was Richard Rowe. I don't know if you know him. He's Australian. So yep. He used to work, he was my mentor. So he was the first chief winemaker I worked with at KWV. And he always said to me, always go back to the basics. You can play around with a lot of things, but go back to the basics and understanding the vineyard. So I will use only whole bunches or stems. Sometimes I will even crush the whole bunches just to get the stems into the tank. So I will only use it when it's at optimum ripeness. I will look at the stems, and then I'll decide in which blocks I can actually add the stems. And So it gives you a different texture, it gives you a different tannin structure, but I won't put that wine as 100% in a bottle. That would always be a component. And the one thing I've trialed with this year especially is, because Pinot Noir is truly South African varietal, and in the textbook of producing Pinot Noirs, they say you never use whole bunches or natural ferment on Pinot Noirs because it creates a lot of volatility. And I've done a 66% whole bunches, 100% natural ferment this year on one of the Pinot Noirs blocks, and it's got the lowest pH, the lowest VA in the whole winery. It's got a, after fermentation, 0.14 VA. It's the lowest in the winery. So sometimes I just feel like we need to throw the textbook away and just push the boundaries a bit, but then get back to the basics. You can make a lot of different components, but going back to the basic and tasting. I taste every morning at 5 a.m. I will walk through the winery, taste every single wine. Every tank is treated differently. There's no recipes. Everything's done on tasting. Then in the afternoon, I'll taste 12 o'clock, I'll taste again. And just before the night shift arrive in the winery, I'll taste again. And making decisions on what do I need to do? Because if I have whole bunches or natural ferment in the winery, it's going to be 100% different than the wines that's been 100% crushed with different yeasts. And I do add yeast to all of the, or not all of the wines, but about 80% of our wines. But the wines that I know, like Shiraz, I do a lot of natural ferment on, and I do the fermentation a bit lower, not high. And it's interesting how the wines just shows more florals, but then also pressing and tasting and doing the cap management is all decisions made on tasting of the wine. So I try not to follow recipes, but just the basic picking date, managing your pH, and selecting the right barrels. That for me is the three basic things that you can't compromise on.